The Making of a Luna. Previous episodes are available on the playlist. You can also visit our website for your favorite stories. A link is provided in the video description. Episode 14. On the battlefield, the sounds of clashing fangs and claws and fierce howls were the dominant auditory phenomena. The outcomes of the battle's conclusion were not discernible, as the prevailing sentiment among all parties, werewolves and lycans alike, was focused on a singular objective: the prevention of fatalities. The following is a list of relevant sources that will be consulted in the course of this study. Elara was situated in a vast conference room, her countenance marked by tears, in proximity to Gwen's throne. They observed the clashing through a substantial mirror on the opposing wall, facilitated by a diminutive witch's spell. This witch had previously cast spells on the students in the forest. The inquiry posed sought to ascertain whether the subject experienced discomfort in light of the combat and fatalities occurring among their fellow werewolves. Gwen inquired with a neutral expression. With a hand held to his head, he regarded the scene as though he were merely an observer, not a participant in this conflict. While he did not appear to be pleased by the deaths, he also did not seem distraught, as if he were completely detached from the situation. Please cease immediately. The rationale behind this approach warrants further examination. It is evident that all individuals possess both souls and hearts. It is imperative to understand why the subjects were directed towards their demise. Elara's voice resonated through the chamber, its timbre altered by the exertion. Historically, she had inflicted harm and taken lives to safeguard her own and others, but the lycans, in a sense, were now innocent, despite their role in the elimination of the werewolves. The lycans engaged in combat were human subjects who had been forcibly transformed into creatures. In contrast to the hunters, who exhibited rational decision-making and autonomy, the lycans were not able to choose to act in accordance with their new state. It is possible that the king's Luna was the one who impeded his ferocity, and that the recognition of Theron as her mate had also led to her transformation. The precise nature of the underlying cause was not discernible, and it was possible that both factors contributed to the phenomenon under investigation. However, she was certain that the continuation of hostilities was ethically untenable. Gwen's response was characterized by a deliberate absence of reply, her countenance devoid of any discernible expression. However, a subtle furrow in his brow indicated a certain internalized displeasure. The speaker asserted that all had lives. It is unclear whether she was referring exclusively to werewolves or werewolves. This revelation profoundly affected him, as werewolves considered lycans to be abominations, creatures that could only be eradicated through their elimination. However, she was also shedding tears for all. A ruler, ostensibly dispatched by the deity, exhibited a display of tears for lycans, despite the fact that the latter had repudiated their existence. It appeared that the deity had committed an error in her design, a circumstance that could be considered ironic. This error was met with enthusiasm. The lycans are of negligible importance, they are merely mindless creatures. The subject of lycanthropy is not a matter of concern for me. He proceeded to substantiate his assertions. The specific identity of the deceased is inconsequential, each individual's contribution is of equal significance. Even lycans were innocent before they were transformed, and it is unjust to condemn them. She stated that she was experiencing a diminution in her emotional control. It is possible that the emotional response exhibited by the subject was influenced by her internalized representation of the character Luna, leading to a sense of sorrow for the lives that were lost. The subject expressed the opinion that the end of the matter at hand would be possible if the other party would consent to become queen. Gwen said, her gaze fixed intently on her. The following is a list of key elements that must be included in any discussion of this subject. After arriving at the rear of the enemy line, Theron utilized his mental faculties to establish a connection between himself, Elias, and the council. I am proceeding. The olfactory sense detects the faint scent of the queen. Retrieval of the queen is the objective. The olfactory sensation was tenuous and barely perceptible. Nevertheless, he was certain of her presence within the fortress, and thus, regardless of the circumstances, he would proceed with all possible haste to her location. We should pause momentarily to consider the possibility of accompanying you. Elias's mind linked back. The lichens exhibited formidable strength, presenting a considerable challenge to the protagonists. While the opposing side had previously suffered a number of defeats, it should be noted that the same could be said for them. No, the number is excessive. I am capable of independently managing the others, therefore, I do not require assistance. Theron then terminated the connection, effectively denying Elias and the others the opportunity to object or attempt to rationalize. In his trajectory, he had continued to confront lichens and rogues. While the majority of the subjects were engaged in combat outside the fortress, it appeared that a contingent remained within the fortification in the event of a breach. However, as previously observed, he disregarded their presence, engaging in combat only to proceed to a location where he perceived the scent to be more pronounced. He only briefly paused upon finding her jacket in a hallway, a discovery that momentarily distracted him. This distraction was promptly exploited. The following is a list of pertinent sources for further study. It appears that further discussion on this matter will be postponed. An uninvited guest has arrived for a visit. Gwen indicated that she would no longer engage in discourse with Elara. He had anticipated Theron's arrival at this location. The recent development of wolfsbane weapons presented a series of challenges in their fabrication. Concurrently, the procurement of the necessary botanical materials became increasingly arduous. This was primarily due to the utilization of the bullets in the prior attacks, which depleted the available supply. This situation persisted until the abduction of Elara, a pivotal event that further complicated the already challenging circumstances. It is important to note that the process itself was arduous and time-consuming. He exhaled, expressing his frustration at the inability to arm his lichens, which would have significantly expedited the conclusion of the war. Fortunately, the guards within the fortress were equipped with these weapons, and their utility was demonstrated. The door subsequently burst open, having been struck by the corpse of a lichen, and Theron entered the room with alacrity. Gwen considered him to be a man of exceedingly limited intelligence. In an effort to assist his companion, he disregarded his personal safety and caution. As previously indicated, she was indeed his Achilles' heel. Fearing for his own life, he had recklessly come to her aid, and had sustained injuries before he could reach her. The subject's abdomen and arms exhibited superficial lacerations. Typically, the wound would have already healed by now, but the fact that a few bullets filled with wolfsbane still slightly grazed his skin indicates otherwise. Due to his high velocity, the bullets did not strike him directly. However, the surface coating of the bullets was sufficient to temporarily hinder his capacity for regeneration. Nevertheless, he remained in a state of considerable vitality. Upon seeing her unharmed countenance, he experienced a sense of relief, as if he could finally draw breath again. Elara was unable to share in his happiness, given his dismay at his current state. "Do not come!" She vocalized a warning when he began to approach, but her cautionary call was not received in a timely manner. The subject's behavior could be characterized as analogous to that of a moth drawn to a flame. Despite the potential for self-destruction, the subject displayed an unwavering propensity to approach the flame. "Refrain from doing so." Elara attempted to continue her statement, but her former teacher, who had moved closer to her, suddenly grasped her neck, preventing her from speaking. Theron's eyes darkened once more at the sight before him. He felt an intense urge to physically subdue the man, but he refrained from any aggressive action, fully aware that a misstep could result in the man's imminent and violent death. It is at this point that the reader is introduced to the Werewolf King, a figure of considerable renown. It is my considered opinion, based on an objective review of the available evidence, that the individual about whom legends have been written was more rational than the subject in question. The subject's response indicated a positive attitude towards the situation. Gwen stated, with his hand still holding his head, a clear sense of ennui evident in his demeanor. The strategic developments that had been initiated by Elara's arrival proved instrumental in his eventual triumph in the battle and subsequent ascension to the throne. He had taken a calculated risk, driven by his resentment towards Theron for having a companion. However, as long as he emerged victorious, the outcome would be optimal. The individual in question issued a demand for the immediate release of their companion, while simultaneously threatening repercussions should this demand go unmet. Theron's countenance darkened, his canines and claws lengthening as he became increasingly enraged. Simultaneously, the room was beginning to be engulfed in his alpha aura. What consequences? This is an excellent example of a humorous statement. It is imperative to recognize that the current circumstances preclude the expression of anger or the making of demands. Gwen uttered the following words, her smile betraying a frigid demeanor that did not extend to her eyes. "I implore you to refrain from doing so. I have always been desirous of ascertaining which of us would prove to be the superior combatant, myself or the king." Gwen informed his closest associate, Abel, who was on his way to Theron. From his throne, the subject removed his black shirt and, emitting a loud roar, transformed himself into his lichen form. It was evident to Theron that the lichen in question was of considerable size. This being was unmistakably the primary lichen, the progenitor who had initiated the transformation of the other lichens engaged in combat in the external environment. However, Gwen's absence remained conspicuous. His visual field was limited to the diminutive female, who appeared frightened, yet she was unable to articulate any words, due to the obstruction of her neck. The individual positioned behind her was gradually releasing his grip, allowing her to breathe but preventing her from speaking. The response is satisfactory. He stated that his gaze shifted toward Gwen, who had approached him gradually before vanishing, with the intention of allaying her concerns. It is a widely held belief that the lichen disappeared, yet Theron's sharp vision discerned that Gwen had swiftly advanced to his side, endeavoring to take him by surprise. It was hypothesized that Theron would continue to act recklessly and in a state of distraction, as he had previously demonstrated. However, Gwen did not perceive that, with Elara in his sights, he was invincible. Theron evaded Gwen with comparable velocity and rapidly delivered a blow to her abdomen. He had intended to strike the individual once more, however, his hand was apprehended by Gwen's substantial, furry appendage, as she endeavored to propel him into the wall. Theron stabilized his feet, thereby avoiding a collision with the wall as Gwen had anticipated. Having already undergone the transformation into dusk, he initiated the coordination process with Gwen, alternating between human and wolf forms in a manner consistent with his previous actions. The two subjects made contact with each other's bodies using their claws and bites. With each collision, a low-frequency vibration was produced throughout the room, causing minute currents of air to appear. The force of their impacts was comparable to that of minor seismic events. The two parties engaged in combat, each exerting maximum effort. Initially, they appeared to be almost equally matched. However, it would be inaccurate to assess their strength in a fair manner, as Theron had already been running for his life to reach Elara and had fought his way inside for the same reason. It is also important to note that the wolfsbane was impeding his regeneration. Despite the evident disadvantages, the discrepancy in power became gradually apparent, and Theron, despite his injuries, gradually overpowered the Leakin. Gwen's ire was further exacerbated by the fact that, despite his present condition, the werewolf had succeeded in maintaining his advantageous position. In response, she vociferously expressed her displeasure, taking a step back in apparent anticipation of a potential loss. The Leakin underwent a transformation that restored his human form, accompanied by the reappearance of his natural ebony hair and blue eyes. Indeed, at this precise moment, he bore a striking resemblance to Theron. He experienced profound aversion when confronted with his father's reflection, as the visage represented the man he had relinquished for his own sake. Consequently, he customarily obscured his true hair color and eyesight through the use of a spell, an incantation that was disrupted upon his metamorphosis into a werewolf. Gwen was on the verge of charging towards Theron in his human form when a gunshot was heard. "What is the nature of your current activity?" Gwen vociferously expressed her displeasure, directing her gaze toward Lucian, as the rogue materialized before the door and discharged a firearm at Theron from a rearward position. "My king." Lucian endeavored to provide an explanation, but he was suddenly aware of Gwen's anger. Initially, he had sought to engage in a fair fight with Theron. However, with the addition of another wolfsbane bullet to his stomach, the probability of such an outcome had significantly diminished. Despite maintaining composure and standing firm, Elara's heart felt profoundly affected by the sight of her beloved in distress. As the situation grew increasingly burdensome, she experienced a growing sense of helplessness in her inability to provide assistance to him or the werewolves engaged in combat in the external environment. The extent of the bloodshed and the profound emotional suffering it engendered was beyond measure. "Sal," she attempted to articulate, but her constricted throat prevented her from doing so, exacerbating her sense of helplessness. Gwen interrupted Lucian, gesturing for him to cease speaking. "It appears that further examination is not possible at this time. The determination of which party possesses superior strength remains to be ascertained. However, it is acknowledged that prior to the execution of the shot, the superiority of the other party was evident." He articulated his sentiments with a sigh. It would be unwise for him to portray himself as the dominant figure, given that he was not. In any case, the ultimate success of the entire battle was attributable to him. Theron continued to disregard Gwen's verbal contributions, as his attention was focused solely on her countenance. His feet were once again moving in her direction, but he only made one step, and Ben constricted her throat more. The situation posed a considerable threat. With each step he took, the likelihood of her demise increased. My male companion is prepared to inflict harm upon her should you advance any closer. It is recommended that the aforementioned actions be ceased. Given the circumstances, it would be prudent to bring this matter to a close. It is imperative to mitigate the loss of life among werewolves. Maintain a stationary position and allow yourself to be killed, or she will be the one to perish," Gwen remarked, directing her gaze toward Theron's already fragile physique. Upon hearing the man's voice, Elara endeavored to dislodge his substantial hand from around her neck in order to reach Theron. However, the hand remained unyielding and immobile. In the direction of the aforementioned individual, she endeavored to extend her arms, her hands clenched in a firm grip, yet relinquished this effort to disengage the man's arm. He regarded her with admiration, noting her smile, which was an uncommon occurrence for the mechanical man, rumored to possess a stone heart. Despite the absence of visible facial discomfort, it was evident to her that he was barely maintaining consciousness. This was understandable, given the severe trauma to his body, which had been pierced by a multitude of wolfsbane bullets, and the subsequent aggressive manipulation by lichens. In accordance with Gwen's directive, a number of lichens that had arrived in the company of Lucian were already in proximity to him. The incisions were meticulously executed, deliberately kept shallow to prolong the agony of death. Gwen endeavored to ensure that his demise was as excruciating as possible. His final moments would be characterized by profound anguish, persisting until the moment of his demise. "Cease immediately. I implore you to cease immediately." The subject exhibited audible signs of distress, including the emission of high-pitched, audible vocalizations, as she made a concerted effort to extricate her arm from the position around her neck. However, there was no response from any of the observers. However, her words fell on deaf ears. It is imperative that the aforementioned behavior be ceased. The alternative option would be the implementation of the requested course of action. The woman's voice expressed a profound sense of suffering as she gazed at the foolish man, who continued to smile at her. She implored him to refrain from alarming her. The subject pondered the capacity of Theron to maintain his mental stability in the face of his evident distress. The subjects had not yet established a marking system, and the female subject was also suppressing her power. However, their bond was strengthening, and she was able to feel all of his emotions and pain as if they were her own. She was aware of the manner in which he could execute the task at hand. He was cognizant of the implications of reacting to their attacks, as it would result in her demise. In the event that Gwen was unable to assume the role of queen, he expressed a preference for her demise. As she grappled with the emotional distress of witnessing the devastation of her cherished being, and felt the burden of anguish fall squarely upon her own shoulders, Naira articulated her sentiments in measured tones. "Elara, use your real power." Upon hearing the voice, she exhibited a startled response. The possibility of Naira having regained consciousness was a conundrum that required further examination. It was hypothesized that she would remain dormant. However, the variable emotional state of Sable and her subsequent suffering appeared to have mitigated the constraints imposed on her. In fact, Naira had exhibited a remarkable degree of resilience, maintaining intermittent consciousness throughout the experiment. Despite her ignorance regarding the precise circumstances, upon Esm's elucidation of the impending events, she became privy to the same information. The rationale behind Elara's repression of her abilities was made evident to her. It is not possible to complete the transfer at this time. The transfer process has not been finalized. Continued pursuit of this objective would inevitably result in the subject's demise. Elara's immediate rejection of this assertion is noteworthy. This was her sister, with whom she had been acquainted since birth. It is evident that the two individuals in question had previously seized Naira's future by absorbing her sister. Therefore, it is perplexing to consider the possibility of inflicting harm upon her once more. The following assertion is made: the wolf's demeanor shifted to one of displeasure, bordering on fury, as he inquired, "For what purpose do you and Sable undertake these actions? For what reason do you both feel that I should be the one to be guarded and protected, that you must sacrifice all for me? I would offer the same assistance to you." Naira vocalized audibly in response. "Avoid Naira at all costs." Elara expressed her internal conflict through tears, stating that she was uncertain about whom to select at that precise juncture. The dilemma she faced was whether to select the foolish man who had adored her and shielded her with unwavering commitment, or Naira, who was regarded as one of the only two genuine sisters she had in this life. Naira had been by her side through all her afflictions. "Elara, if you find yourself unable to make the decision, I am prepared to make it on your behalf." Naira proceeded with measured steps, approaching a portal that was just beginning to take shape. The substance in question manifested as a transparent aqueous solution within the wolf's chamber. However, its appearance suggested that it was not in its complete, original state, but rather had undergone an alteration or repair. She directed her gaze toward the portal, and, without further hesitation, she initiated the transfer of her consciousness through the portal that had only recently begun to form. Esm had previously elucidated the significance of the ring to Elara on the occasion of her first wear of the ring. Firstly, it is imperative that she never remove the device. Secondly, Naira's ability to traverse the portal is contingent upon its complete formation. This transition will be signaled by the shift in the ring's color from blue to red. Presently, the ring exhibits only a fraction of the blue hue, measuring approximately 1/4 to 1/3 of the total intensity. This would result in the probable demise of Naira. Elara experienced profound sorrow, questioning the unfortunate turn of events and the necessity of her own decisions. The rationale behind the perceived necessity for the subject's life to be subject to such a high degree of sacrifice is not readily apparent. At the nadir of her emotional state, and bereft of Naira's presence, Sable came to the realization that she had once again become the sole occupant of the wolf's chamber. "Elara, I am aware of your emotional distress, and I, too, am distraught. However, it is imperative that we bring an end to this situation. The present moment is of paramount importance. Come in our chamber." Sable vociferated internally. Elara envisioned herself in the chamber for a second time, as if she were an inanimate object in the external environment. In this imagined state, she appeared to be stationary, devoid of any sentience. This state of being was reminiscent of a doll without a soul. Elara then proceeded to move towards Sable with haste. She had anticipated that the latter would relocate in a manner similar to previous instances, yet Sable did not comply. The wolf, standing on all fours, lowered her head and brought her forehead into contact with Elara's. Elara, it is evident that we have never fully tapped into our latent potential. We have not yet released it in the optimal manner. Allow me to demonstrate our true capabilities. The werewolves, in their unrelenting struggle, exhibited a fierce tenacity, engaging in combat with the lichens, who, in their ferocity, displayed a disregard for their own safety. For these individuals, the imperative to engage in combat took precedence over considerations of personal welfare. Consequently, in their demise, they nevertheless succeeded in taking a werewolf with them, or at the very least, inflicting severe injury upon one. The werewolves were fatigued from their extensive travels, which further compounded their challenging circumstances. Nevertheless, under the direction of Elias and the members of the council, they maintained their position in opposition to the lichens. The only viable recourse available to them was to maintain their hold on the fortress, in the hope that it would suffice to allow sufficient time for Theron to return with their queen. The following text is intended to provide a comprehensive overview of the subject matter. Within the confines of the fortress, Theron persevered, maintaining his composure despite the discomfort, his gaze fixed intently on his beloved companion. He was genuinely concerned, as Elara had ceased to cry and resist, which would have been a positive development, if at the same time she did not appear to be a puppet. The subject experienced a state of trepidation due to the profound impact of witnessing the demise of the entity before her physical eyes. This event, characterized by its intense and unexpected nature, induced a state of profound psychological distress, which was likely to leave an indelible mark on her psyche. He aspired to take action, to approach her and assure her that all would be well, yet he found himself unable to do so. These were the final reflections that occupied his consciousness before he lost consciousness and fell to the ground. "Ben, please release your grip on her neck. The emotional distress inflicted upon her is exceedingly profound." Gwen expressed her displeasure. It was evident that the rogue's bloodthirstiness remained undiminished. Despite Ben's attempts to temper his cruelty, the rogue persistently exhibited an inclination toward excessive violence. Nevertheless, if the situation involved another individual, he would not be concerned. However, in the case of this person, he experienced a sense of proximity and a strong inclination to provide protection. The threat of lethal force was only employed to compel the werewolf to relinquish its aggressive actions, not as a direct threat to Theron's physical well-being. He was reluctant to engage in that course of action, and Ben should have been cognizant of this reluctance. However, Ben's actions exceeded the boundaries of his designated role. His actions were becoming increasingly erratic. "My king, if I were to release my hold on her, she would attempt to escape once more," Ben replied, expressing dissatisfaction. It was evident that Elara's lack of reaction was not due to a lack of concern, but rather to an as yet unidentified factor, which served only to exacerbate his unease. This period can be likened to the period preceding a storm, in that it was characterized by a sense of calm and stability. It should be noted that the subject was unaware of the factors that impeded Elara's ability to utilize her werewolf abilities. However, it was evident that she occupied the dominant position within the Watcher community. Based on observations of her training regimens, it was reasonable to speculate that her potential for strength was considerable. He was unwilling to take a chance. The following investigation was conducted at the coven. "Have you discerned anything of note?" Vanessa inquired, her tone conveying a sense of trepidation, as the diminutive witch's gaze descended upon her cauldron. Esme had filled the cauldron with water and used an enchantment to make the surface of the liquid into a mirror, allowing her to observe the situation. Despite their inability to act, their concern persisted. "It is hypothesized that Sable is breaking the seal," Esme articulated, her voice marked by a discernible hesitancy. "However, Naira?" Vanessa inquired with a sense of concern. In the event that Sable were to act in a manner that would be perceived as challenging or confrontational, what consequences might befall the subordinate wolf? "I am uncertain, but it is possible that the psychological stress was excessive. It is possible that Sable may have experienced a momentary lapse in her ability to maintain control over her aura, or that Naira's awakening was triggered by the emotional upheaval they both experienced," she said, directing her gaze toward the ground. Elara's countenance bore an uncanny resemblance to a statue, suggesting a state of resignation or acquiescence. However, further observation revealed otherwise. It has been observed that the subject in question is displaying signs of mobility. Esme proceeded with her observations, noting alterations in Elara's behavior after a brief interval. "She is?" Vanessa inquired, ascending to the elevated surface of the table and casting a downward gaze into the cauldron. "It is evident that the subject in question is not, in fact, a wolf." Vanessa articulated her astonishment. The aforementioned statement is indeed erroneous. Esme's realization, upon comprehending the goddess's intentions, marked a pivotal moment in her understanding, akin to the completion of a complex puzzle, wherein all the pieces fell into place. "That is a true ruler chosen by the goddess," she said, her tone a mixture of smugness and calmness as she attempted to regain her composure. "The location in question is Gwen's residence." "Ben, I will not reiterate my previous statements," Gwen articulated, raising her voice. However, the Watcher's former instructor was unable to respond to the order. From the woman devoid of power, who had not experienced the werewolf transformation until this moment, a substantial pressure could be perceived as she experienced a loosening of her grip due to fear. The emotion in question was one that he had not experienced since his early years as a pup. This peculiarity led him to question the nature of the sensation itself, given its unusual and enigmatic character. It is perplexing to hypothesize that he would experience trepidation from a woman who, mere moments prior, was incapable of even slightly opening his hand to extricate her from a tight grip. However, it would not take long for Ben to ascertain that this was indeed the emotion of fear he was experiencing. Swiftly turning around, she forcefully pushed his hand away with her right hand, then grasped his neck with her other hand, lifting him slightly off the ground. The initial surprise of the reversed situation was less pronounced in comparison to the preceding events that were registered by his eyes. Elara's hair underwent a remarkable transformation before the eyes of Elara and Gwen, assuming a hue that closely resembled the color of her wolf's fur. This metamorphosis occurred from the roots to the very tips of her hair, marking a significant change in its appearance. However, the alteration in her hair color paled in comparison to the rapid metamorphosis that was transpiring on her countenance. Typically, during the process of partial transformation, a werewolf would undergo changes in the pigmentation of its eyes, the length of its canines, and the reshaping of its nails into claws. However, she was not undergoing a complete metamorphosis, nor was she transforming into a wolf. The subject's eyes transitioned from their typical warm chocolate hue to a golden shade. Her skin, which was previously smooth and unadorned, exhibited a thin layer of soft white fur along the edges of her face. Her small ears underwent a transformation, becoming wolf ears, and her canines protruded from her mouth. Her hands, covered in fur, further contributed to her lupin appearance. Despite these changes, the subject's face retained a human-like aspect, suggesting a hybrid identity that combines werewolf and human characteristics. "What is your purpose here?" Ben attempted to inquire, as he had never before encountered such a specimen. Elara, with her hand maintaining a firm grip on his neck, oscillated her head from side to side, as if her body was not yet accustomed to its movements, while also attempting to relax her neck, which was rapidly healing from the previous hold. Upon concluding the act of cracking her neck, she gazed into his eyes, causing him to tremble. It appeared as though she could discern the essence of his being. He experienced a sense of profound disquiet, as if he were observing a being that should never be the slightest bit offended. She initiated verbal communication, her facial expression devoid of expression, a marked departure from her previous countenance. She addressed her former instructor in a deliberate manner. The subject's value as a potential mate is deemed to be below the acceptable threshold. The voice articulated a sense of solemnity, however, it did not emanate from Elara. The auditory experience resembled the simultaneous utterance of two distinct entities, as if Sable and Elara had amalgamated into a singular voice. The subjects in question were not of either the werewolf or human species. They were neither werewolf nor wolf. At this particular moment, their two personalities were indistinguishable. It is evident that the subject's scent is exceedingly potent, with an overabundance of blood, suggesting a profound corruption. She stated that, prior to the forceful impact of his body against the wall, he exhibited a state of apparent lifelessness. This occurred immediately upon her retraction of her hand. Upon seeing his brother deceased, Abel's mental clarity, previously obscured by the haze induced by her power, was abruptly restored, prompting him to rapidly approach her. However, he was struck by an unknown force, resulting in his lifeless descent and the subsequent severing of his neck. At this juncture, Gwen found herself immobilized. He had been taken aback by her appearance from the very moment he laid eyes on her, yet nothing could prepare him for the effect she was having on him now. He felt incapable of articulating any thoughts or responses. Despite her swift advance, he remained entirely unresponsive. His sole physical response was to follow her movements with his eyes. All those present were immobilized, as if under the same spell, including the Lycans who had previously assaulted Theron and were now standing nearby. These Lycans had ceased their attack on the unconscious man. Lucian's reaction to the apparition before him was immediate, and he attempted to discharge his firearm at the figure. However, the temporal constraints prevented him from executing his intentions. Elara's arrival at the door was marked by an astonishing degree of speed. She was enraged, and she seized the weapon that Lucian was holding. Lucian had used this weapon to inflict harm upon Elara's loved ones, and Elara deformed it, rendering it unusable. This occurred just before Lucian had the opportunity to fire a single bullet. "You as well, you have lost too much blood." Her resonant voice issued forth, and as the man endeavored to regain his composure and attempted to strike her, she swiftly vanished from his line of sight, subsequently materializing behind him. He did not have the opportunity to observe her countenance a second time. Despite the fact that he had considered turning around, he only experienced the shock of colliding with the frigid, unyielding wall, as she had forcefully thrust his body against the opposite wall with her foot. In order to ensure that no weapons could be used against Theron, she promptly advanced to his side, where the lichens were encircling him. Gwen had anticipated an attack by the lichens, despite the absence of an explicit order from the group leader. This anticipation was rooted in the lichens' documented tendency to engage in impulsive aggression towards any individual who approached them. He could already envision them inflicting harm upon her, and he was about to command them not to. Nonetheless, he refrained from verbalizing his thoughts. It is noteworthy that they did not physically interact with her in any way, and they also moved to one side, creating an opening for her to approach Theron. The imperative voice issued a command to the subject, instructing them to take action against the individual in question. The nature of the action was to terminate the life of the individual. Gwen expressed her displeasure, but was taken aback once more when the lichens remained stationary, not displaying any response. It was as if they were awaiting further directives. The question arises as to why the lichens would acquiesce to the directives of Theron, which were to cease hostilities, rather than continue their assault as Theron had instructed. It is imperative to consider the question of whose authority they would defer to if not his. Positioned in a kneeling posture adjacent to him, she perceived his respiration to be of a diminished depth. Given the presence of wolfbane in his blood, he would not face immediate peril. However, given the numerous lacerations across his body that were still hemorrhaging, it was inevitable that he was gradually succumbing to weakness. Her heart felt pierced by a multitude of sharp sensations, as she gently embraced his head, fearful of causing him further distress. Her golden eyes narrowed, and tears once again began to fall from her eyes. She then gently placed a kiss on his forehead. This individual had extricated her from imminent peril, providing a protective barrier against external threats and safeguarding her from the influence of her family. His actions were characterized by selfless devotion, marked by a profound love that transcended the expectation of reciprocity. He had even demonstrated an unwavering willingness to sacrifice his own life for hers, an act that was not undertaken lightly. "I apologize, my dear." Typically, only the male would mark his mate, but in this case, the female has taken on that role. "I am not a normal mate," Elara articulated in a hushed manner, disengaging her lips from his forehead, yet maintaining proximity of her countenance to his. Subsequently, she directed a focused, affectionate gaze at him, gradually raising his neck, thereby unveiling his pale skin, and then firmly sank her fangs into the crevice where the shoulder meets the neck. Since time immemorial, it has been customary for males to mark their mates. This practice has been observed to enhance the physical strength of both parties, fortify their alliance, and finalize their pairing. In this particular instance, the female's mark serves to reinforce their connection, thereby facilitating the male's regeneration process. Upon observing the circumstances, Gwen proceeded to adopt a state of heightened agitation, propelling her towards the subjects in a vehement manner. He expressed a desire to separate Theron from her arms. In the event that the Lycans failed to respond to his directives for reasons that were not readily apparent, he would undertake the task himself. It is reasonable to conclude that the aforementioned individual's actions were consistent with his intentions. However, it should be noted that he did not anticipate the immediate response of the Lycans, who moved in his direction, apparently intending to obstruct his progress. Perceiving an unmistakable killing intent emanating from the others, he came to a halt, thoroughly perplexed. The subject was their superior, and he had created them. They would comply with his directives, even if he instructed them to take their own lives. However, at that precise moment, those very same Lycans felt like enemies. Elara removed her fangs from Theron's neck in a calm manner, and Theron's color gradually returned to his face as his wounds immediately started to close. Subsequently, he also opened his eyes. He had not observed the transformation of the being before him, but intuitively recognized that it was Elara. The subject experienced a simultaneous feeling of elation and melancholy, attributable to the perception of the subject's own physical strength. It is conceivable that the profound desolation experienced by the former might have precipitated a dissolution in Sable's composure, culminating in uninhibited escapades. The utterance of "I am sorry" is indicative of remorse. The speaker made an assertion, yet failed to provide the necessary details. Nonetheless, he was aware of her remorse. He perceived it in her eyes. She was sorry for having marked him without his consent. However, he was unaware of the possibility that a woman could do so. It is evident that the decision to place him in harm's way was a regrettable one. It appeared that the woman had not yet grasped the extent of his devotion and readiness to sacrifice himself for her benefit. In the event that he was compelled to relieve the experience, he would readily accept the prospect of death. Observing the manner in which you have designated me as your possession, he articulated, his words met with a flinch from her, her countenance betraying a sense of apprehension. Was he experiencing emotional distress? It is imperative to acknowledge the necessity of assuming responsibility for oneself, as well as for others. He persisted, the corner of his mouth tending to rise in a smile. She experienced a sense of relief, and his continued thoughts about her were endearing. His boldness was also a source of amusement for her. Observing the joy exhibited by the couple before him, Gwen vocalized a significant utterance, transitioning once more into her Lycan form. He expressed a desire to kill Theron as expeditiously as possible. The final member of the royal family, the individual who ultimately disavowed his own existence, represents a poignant culmination of the royal lineage. He was a person who was not intended to exist, yet he was present. The question arises as to why such individuals would persist in maintaining a relationship with a partner. The question arises as to why Theron should continue to exist, perpetually evoking the memory of the father who was lost to him, the sole individual who genuinely cherished him, and also the one who never perceived him as adequate in his own right, precisely as he was, a hybrid. In his Lycan form, he effortlessly overpowered the Lycans that had previously attempted to confront Elara and Theron. He was determined to kill Theron, or, at the very least, perish at Elara's hand. In any event, the situation was significantly superior to the one in which he had been for the entirety of the period under consideration. Gwen advanced 2 steps in their direction, the sound of his substantial legs generating a vibration that was perceptible to the floor as he moved. He was on the verge of raising his clawed hand, anticipating Elara's imminent termination of his life, in a manner analogous to her actions against the others. "Kneel." Her voice resonated with an authoritative tone. The word was of minimal significance to him, yet it precipitated a precipitous descent, resulting in a genuflecting posture before her, a posture he had not intentionally initiated. "The transformation into a human being is imperative." She asserted her demand with a voice that resonated powerfully. He acquiesced to the words, albeit reluctantly. I paid close attention to her utterances, and his countenance conveyed a sentiment that his verbal expression failed to articulate. "It is imperative to consider the implications of non-compliance with the directives of the ruling authority." Elara and Sable responded in unison, comprehending the implications of his unspoken utterances. "What?" The Lycans were never subject to governance, as their very existence was considered illegitimate. He was incapable of articulating his thoughts, his mind unable to comprehend the depth of her message. The goddess was unable to recognize the Lycans. However, the woman standing before him, who was a ruler designated for werewolves, asserted that she was his ruler as well. The veracity of her words was questionable, but the possibility of their inaccuracy remained. Nevertheless, the werewolves who had formerly heeded his directives and safeguarded her were also inclined to protect her from that moment on. "It is evident that he has complied with her directives. How is it that you have assumed the role of authority over the werewolves?" He made a second attempt to articulate his thoughts. The assertion that a ruler is constrained in their ability to lead across multiple racial groups has been called into question. Sable and Elara engaged in further discourse, maintaining the same grave demeanor. Her words were not intended to be facetious or derisive, rather, she was earnest in her communication, conveying the present state of affairs with candor. "For what reason have you refrained from taking my life thus far?" Gwen inquired once more, this time without soliciting an explanation regarding the basis of her authority as ruler of the Lycans. The evidence was manifest in the subject's physical response, which remained unresponsive to the subject's commands. This indicated that the subject had the capacity to exercise authority over the Lycans. A ruler imposed by the goddess does not necessarily know the Lycans. "I am unable to comprehend them, therefore, I request your assistance in this matter." Elara articulated her perspective with marked conviction. She had perceived no potential for the rogues in his company to achieve a future state, yet through his perspective, she discerned the possibility for transformation. Furthermore, she did not perceive herself as capable of killing someone who so closely resembled her beloved. "For what purpose would I do such a thing?" Gwen inquired, yet despite his exertions, he was unable to elevate even an inch from the ground. "It is erroneous to assume that I am posing a question. I am not. I am commanding." The following is a list of relevant sources that will assist in the preparation of this paper. Outside the fortress, the werewolves were encountering significant challenges in their efforts to restrain the Lycans. They found themselves unable to make any progress in this regard. Elias had initially theorized that he and the council could accompany Theron. However, if they did so, the rest of the werewolves would have fallen by now. The subject was heard to mutter continuously in his mind as he evaded a Lycan and expelled him. The ability to engage in rational discourse with the beings in question would undoubtedly simplify the situation, however, this capacity is not within the realm of their capabilities. It is unfortunate that these individuals, who were initially considered normal and innocent, have been subjected to such treatment. With haste and a sense of displeasure, he lamented the hasty arrival that had failed to amass a more formidable werewolf contingent. He then proceeded to assist another werewolf who exhibited a level of potency that exceeded his own. It has been a considerable amount of time since Theron's departure. One might inquire whether he has encountered a surfeit of challenges. In an attempt to establish a mind link, he initiated a mental communication, yet the subject did not reciprocate. The question remains whether they could survive the night. The subject was under the impression that he was being pursued by 2 additional werewolves shortly after providing assistance to another werewolf. He articulated a series of expletives under his breath as the werewolves prepared to leap at him, their sizable claws visibly extended. In the moonlight, a solitary woman was observed standing on the fortress wall. Her white-silver hair reflected and blended with the moon's light, and small twinkle sparkles could be seen between the strands that fluttered in the wind. The subject's appearance, even in her transformed state, could be described as ethereal, evoking the qualities of a mirage rather than a tangible human being. The subject's physical attractiveness was indisputable, however. The chaos among the werewolves was so intense that they did not have the opportunity to observe the fortifications, as their attention was occupied with their confrontations. Elara's voice resonated through the night, expressing profound dismay at the bloodshed and fatalities that had already transpired. The sudden auditory stimulus prompted a collective glance upward from the group. The werewolves were taken aback by the woman's sudden manifestation and sensed her formidable presence. They were inclined to acquiesce, yet ultimately did not, as she exhibited characteristics more indicative of a werewolf than a werewolf. Upon observing the cessation of hostilities among the lichens, suspicion regarding her provenance was aroused. The inquiry posed pertains to the nature of her relationship with the subjects in question, specifically whether she was their superior and whether she was attempting to issue them with new directives. The members of the council and Elias immediately engaged in a process of mind-linking, which led them to perceive the werewolves as potentially dangerous and to exercise caution in regard to the new presence. Following the cessation of her vociferations, Elara directed her gaze toward the lichens, observing their compliance with satisfaction. This constituted the third rationale that precluded her from killing Gwen. The number of innocent bystanders was excessive, and she could not take the lives of individuals who had committed no wrongdoing. Kneel. She reiterated her statement with a significantly more robust voice, her words reverberating throughout the entirety of the battlefield. She demanded obedience from the lichens. A rational discussion with them was not possible in a brief period. In order to elicit a state of pause and facilitate the application of reason, it is necessary to first subdue the subjects, and then pose inquiries. The lichens, under the astonished gaze of the werewolves, listened in unison. This master exhibited a marked deviation from the expected norm. The rationale behind her directive to kneel, thereby leaving them vulnerable before the werewolves, is unclear. It is debatable whether this gesture offered an opportunity for the werewolves to readily eliminate them. This was an opportunity that had already been identified by some of them. However, the werewolves did not initiate any actions, as they were apprehensive about the individual who had the capacity to command thousands of werewolves. The members of the council were meticulous in their observation of her actions, and had already begun to contemplate an offensive maneuver. If the master could be controlled, then the lichens would be compelled to comply. This was the objective of the aforementioned individuals, an objective that was rendered moot by the transformation of the woman. The auditory backdrop of cracking sounds of bones accompanied the transformation of her diminutive hands into immense paws, a transformation facilitated by her prior kneeling posture. The subject's mandibles were observed to have opened and extended, thus forming a large snout. Her tender white skin, which had been partially covered by fur, was now entirely engulfed by it. Elara vocalized an exclamation of discomfort, undergoing a second transformation in her lifetime into the lupin form of Sable. The passage of time had undoubtedly contributed to this phenomenon, yet the act of shifting position induced a state of breathlessness. Following the completion of the transformation, the subject vocalized a howl, thereby reinstating the demand for obedience. In this instance, however, in lieu of the lichens, the werewolves immediately genuflected. The subjects immediately succumbed to the impact, collapsing on the ground and presenting their necks in a state of submission. A war that had been anticipated to culminate in a state of bloodshed, with one side expected to face inevitable destruction, was brought to a halt by the brief appearance of a solitary woman, the ruler of the lichens and the queen of the werewolves. The following investigation focuses on a coven of witches. The question has been posited as to why the goddess would bestow rulership upon the lichens. Vanessa inquired, her tone conveying a sense of perplexity. Typically, the diminutive feline was adept at comprehending matters, however, on this occasion, it eluded her comprehension, evading the desire and intentions of the Supreme Being. Lichens, they were created by foolish werewolves, yet they themselves have committed no wrongdoing simply by existing. Notwithstanding the absence of initial culpability, subsequent killings and destruction resulting from their actions remain subject to oversight and regulation. Notwithstanding, their existence persists at the threshold between the supernatural realm and the human domain. Consequently, the question arises as to which of these two worlds would be capable of accepting them, and in which environment could they continue to exist. Of particular significance is the inquiry regarding the entity capable of providing them with a structured, hierarchical society. By taking this action, she has made a compromise in order to provide a home for them. This compromise is exemplified by the existence of Elara. Elara wields the authority to command them, as the goddess taboo specifically pertains to the killing of the werewolf, yet makes no mention of the lichen who was created by his sin. As the lichens were not creatures under the goddess's rule, they could very well rampant everywhere without fear of punishment or consequences for not abiding by the laws previously established. However, she has recently adopted a compromise position, acknowledging the lichens as a component of the supernatural realm, while concurrently imposing constraints on them. Furthermore, the attempt by other werewolves to revive the lichens would prove futile, as any such revived lichens would be subject to Elara's authority and could not be utilized as instruments of aggression at will. After a brief period, Esme concurred. Vanessa was taken aback by the depth of insight Esme had revealed, and even more astonished by the extent of the elaboration she had provided. Typically, the explanations provided by the bubbly witch are so concise that they tend to engender more confusion than comprehension. The location in question is Gwen's residence. The werewolves were profoundly unsettled, and the recently emerged werewolf underwent a transformation into a lupin form, swiftly compelling them to genuflect. The plausibility of this phenomenon is a subject of considerable interest. The ease with which they succumbed to her power is a subject of interest. The only werewolf capable of compelling submission through the mere act of howling was their king, the sole entity endowed with such a profound aura. However, upon deeper contemplation, they recognized that another werewolf might also possess this ability. This individual was none other than the queen they had come to rescue. In the event that the individual in question was indeed her, the act of submission on their part appeared to be a spontaneous and natural response. The collective consciousness of the group was profoundly altered, as the realization that the figure of authority standing upon the wall was none other than the individual known as the powerful person permeated their shared awareness. Despite their initial uncertainty, the remaining members of the pack were able to comprehend the situation when Theron established a mind link with the entire pack, thereby confirming her position. It is imperative that all resistance be immediately ceased, and that homage be rendered to the Queen. Theron issued the directive. Elara proceeded ahead of him, motivated by an urgent desire to bring an end to the confrontation promptly. Upon observing her aura and becoming cognizant of her genuine authority, he consented to her request. Upon exiting the fortress and approaching Elara's wolf, Theron's midnight wolf advanced toward his mate's visage, delicately tracing its contours with his own, thereby confirming to all present werewolves that the recently transformed wolf was indisputably his queen. This act effectively dispelled any lingering uncertainties regarding her legitimacy, a conclusion that was further reinforced by the evident ease with which they had acquiesced to her authority. The two wolves, one black and one white, with contrasting colored furs, appear as different as night and day. One appeared soft and elegant, while the other bore an air of solemnity and severity. However, a closer observation revealed that their eyes held a unity, as if they were two pieces of a whole. The subjects' interactions were symbiotic, akin to the complementary relationship between the night sky and the moon. Following the substantiation that the werewolves were subject to Elara's absolute authority, akin to Gwen, Theron established a mind link with the werewolves, issuing an order for their return. A significant proportion of the subjects exhibited signs of physical strain, as evidenced by injuries and fatigue. Consequently, their presence was no longer required, and they were permitted to return to their homes. The explanations for this phenomenon would be provided subsequently, following the resolution of the situation with the lichens. The werewolves promptly departed at Theron's behest, though they harbored a sense of curiosity regarding the newly installed queen and had sought to behold her countenance. The only individuals privy to her true identity were Elias, the council members, Elara's Moonlight Pack, and several werewolves from the academy. However, these latter individuals were under the command of a higher-ranked werewolf, which precluded them from disseminating information regarding her to their families, let alone to other werewolves. Furthermore, the formidable strength of the queen, evidenced by her dominion over the lichens, renders her a figure of considerable interest. However, it is evident that none would articulate their perspective in the presence of the two royals. The subject's only recourse was to await the Queen's formal presentation. It is highly probable that, in due course, the Queen will assume her rightful position as the Luna of all the packs. It is noteworthy that the King did not disclose his thoughts. The soon presumed official presentation of the Queen was postponed. The petty king prohibited the disclosure of her identity and sequestered her within the royal palace for an extended period. As the majority of the werewolves withdrew, the sole remaining individuals were the council members and Elias. As with the other werewolves, Elias and the members of the council had not anticipated this outcome, this peaceful resolution. However, they had not foreseen that their queen would be such an exceptional being. The subjects were aware of the queen's identity, however, they were unaware of her abilities. Following the departure of the werewolves, the lichens were the sole remaining inhabitants of the snow-covered terrain. The creature's posture remained in a kneeling position, and while the werewolves exhibited facial expressions of confusion and a slight reluctance to comply with her directives prior to ascertaining her identity, the lichens' faces exhibited no discernible emotional expression. The two wolves that approached them appeared to be devoid of emotions such as discontent, anger, or fright. This peculiar state of emotional absence was a source of slight disquiet for Elara. She expressed concern that they had become devoid of their inherent human qualities. She underwent a transformation into her previous lichen appearance, as she believed this to be the most probable choice. She then issued a command to the lichen that was in closest proximity to her. The transformation into one's human self is imperative. Elara's ignorance of werewolves precluded her from assessing the subject's potential for transformation. Nevertheless, she endeavored to ascertain this information. The lichen, devoid of the same emotional faculties as its counterparts, underwent a metamorphosis into a humanoid female, characterized by the presence of lacrimation in her eyes, a stark contrast to the typical lichen form. Elara exhaled, experiencing a sense of relief as she observed the fair-haired individual with blue eyes lying on the ground. This apparent development indicated the possibility of a favorable outcome for them. The subjects were no longer able to resume their lives in human urban centers. However, as long as they were able to metamorphose into human form and communicate with her, they would still have a future. In their lichen form, they were incapable of articulating even the simplest of words. Through dialogue with the subject, it was ascertained that, in their lichen form, the subjects experienced an innate compulsion to engage in rampage and destruction. However, their true selves were repressed, thereby preventing them from acting in accordance with their rational judgment and restraint. It was also revealed that the lichens typically underwent transformation only under the influence of a full moon or at the behest of their master. Accordingly, Elara's directives, when executed, would impede the subject's destructive inclinations during the lunar cycle. Consequently, the subjects would be capable of leading a relatively typical existence. At this juncture, the council members and Elias had congregated in proximity to Elara and Theron. Upon conclusion of her discourse, she immediately genuflected before her. Elara's surprise was evident in her reaction to the actions. Previously, she had compelled all werewolves to genuflect, however, she did not seek to demand their respect. However, the elder's silent kneeling prompted her to revert to her usual demeanor, as she found herself at a loss for an appropriate response. She sought Theron's counsel, yet he remained silent. This gesture was interpreted as a tacit endorsement of their actions, and it fell upon Elara to grant them permission to rise. It is evident that the subject in question has the capacity to rise. Elara's tone exhibited a subtle increase in emotional intensity, accompanied by a slight reddening of her cheeks, suggesting a momentary lapse in composure. However, the courteous werewolves rose obediently at her command and refrained from any comments or actions that might be perceived as disrespectful. At this time, Theron was relishing her appearance. He perceived the emotional fluctuations within her, a consequence of the recently established connection. Your Highness, we are delighted to hear that you have been rescued and are now out of harm's way. The leader council member stated the following. The elder's contentment was evident, as evidenced by the moisture in his eyes. The stern countenance of the council members that she had previously observed at the opening ceremony was not evident in this moment. The reason for this change was unclear to her, but the council members appeared more akin to doting grandparents than to the intrepid werewolves she had previously encountered. Nonetheless, she did not engage in rumination regarding these musings. There remained tasks to be completed. The most salient issue is the fate of Naira. She is eager to ascertain her current circumstances. The Lycans were instructed to adhere to a set of stringent directives. These directives included the following. First, they were to remain within the fortress's confines. Second, they were to refrain from inflicting harm upon any individual. And third, they were to detain any rogues or humans discovered within the fortress. In accordance with her directive, the Lycans imprisoned those humans who had cooperated with Gwen, Elara, and Theron. These individuals were instructed to proceed expeditiously to the royal palace, where Esm would await their arrival. The witch had previously dispatched one of her doves to inform them of her imminent arrival to inspect the ring. Prior to their departure from the fortress, Elara and Theron also returned to the chamber where Gwen had been compelled to kneel. The man, who exhibited reluctance, had abandoned his attempts to liberate himself from her authority, acknowledging the futility of his endeavors. Elara proceeded with haste, issuing her command to the kneeling individual while simultaneously enforcing the same directives upon the recipient, akin to the instructions previously issued to the Lycans outside. The royal palace is the site of the following events. Despite their fatigue, both physically and mentally, the two wolves proceeded directly to the palace, continuing until they reached their private quarters, where Lila awaited them. The subjects continued beyond the point at which they would typically halt, such as at the gates. Theron had only established a mind link with the guards, who had consequently opened the gates for them in advance. The wolves advanced at the utmost velocity, surpassing the guards as they traversed the landscape. The guards were profoundly astonished by the sight of the white wolf, which closely followed the king. The three individuals and the diminutive feline did not engage in cordial exchange, as the collective disposition was not conducive to such behavior. Elara promptly entrusted the ring to Esm for a thorough examination. Examining the ring more closely, the witch found that it appeared normal, devoid of any discernible anomalies. This was particularly disconcerting, as even the blue hue that typically surrounded the stone had completely disappeared. The stone had undergone a complete reversion to its original state. Its appearance had returned precisely to its form prior to Elara's placement of it on her finger several weeks prior. The sight of the red stone caused Elara to experience a visceral reaction, as if she had been struck by a bolt of electricity. She had not previously had the opportunity to observe the ring's color, due to her apprehension about doing so. Esm exhaled audibly, her countenance betraying an apparent despondency regarding the likelihood of success. Nevertheless, she proceeded to conduct the final inspection. With a dexterous motion, the witch delicately placed the ring on her finger, simultaneously raising her hand in an upward gesture. They remained motionless, their breaths held in anticipation of the unfolding events. It appeared as though they were anticipating a response from the red stone, indicating its capacity to hold Naira and facilitate the transfer of the wolf to the witch. It is evident that, cognitively, All parties were aware that for the ring to function, it was imperative that they observe the inverse process that had been initiated when Elara had worn it. This transformation entailed the reversion of the blue color to the periphery, thereby enabling the red color to predominate across the entire stone. However, this resulted in the stone acquiring a red hue. The passage of time was marked by seconds, then minutes. Not a single individual had the audacity to suggest that Naira had in fact passed away. Elara's contemplation of the stone evoked a multifaceted emotional response, initially marked by hope, followed by a sense of resignation, and ultimately culminating in a profound sense of sadness. Tears began to trickle down her face at a gradual pace. Upon observing his melancholic companion, Theron extended his hand and placed it on her shoulder, followed by a tender kiss on her temple. He was unable to provide solace through verbal means, his only recourse was to offer physical presence. Elara found herself unable to articulate the obvious, yet she remained stationary, her gaze fixed intently on the object before her. Theron, Esme, and Vanessa also remained motionless. 10 minutes had elapsed, and the ring remained under close observation. However, Esme did not experience any sensation, not even the slightest trace of magic. At this juncture, she gradually lifted her gaze toward Elara. The young lady she had observed mature had crimson eyes and was silently shedding tears. Her fatigue was palpable. The formidable power exhibited by Elara, the profound emotional impact of the abduction, and the comprehensive experience that ensued, were manifest in her physical and psychological state. She was at imminent risk of losing her balance, but was able to maintain her position by waiting for the results of the tests. This revelation compounded the challenge of verbal communication for the witch, as she was acutely aware that the impending words would inevitably inflict profound emotional distress upon Elara. However, she deemed it more ethically sound to avert further exacerbation of her emotional state. Elara, Naira. Esme endeavored to articulate her thoughts, yet she encountered significant difficulty in expressing the fact that she was not within the confines of the ring. After collecting herself and maintaining her composure, Esme proceeded to articulate her thoughts once more. Her countenance exhibited a slight tremor, and she struggled to contain her tears as she articulated her sentiments in a hoarse voice. She is. However, Esme's discourse was momentarily interrupted by the sensation of a diminutive portal materializing within her lupin domain. As she continued to observe the stone, she also maintained her concentration on the location. She did not persist in her verbalization, opting instead to observe the unfolding events with keen interest. She was apprehensive about uttering something hastily and thus rekindling Elara's hope. Consequently, she concentrated intently on the portal to discern the origins of the sounds she had perceived. Alive. Esme concluded her statement in a deliberate manner, at which point a faint murmur emanated from beyond the portal. The utterance was met with a query, "What?" Elara inquired, her voice tinged with a mixture of astonishment and trepidation. "She is alive." Her words could be discerned, and she implored that one should not be concerned. A marked shift in the witch's mood was evident, with a notable transition from a state of sadness to one of happiness, as indicated by the presence of a broad smile. Elara's weeping intensified, enveloping Theron in her embrace. However, the tears she shed were no longer of sorrow, they were now imbued with a joyous sentiment. Her consciousness was on the verge of dissolution, and thus, upon receiving the auspicious news, Elara finally succumbed to her weariness. Theron swiftly augmented his grip on her, discerning her vulnerability, and prevented his beautiful mate's body from falling to the ground. The following is a list of relevant sources that will assist in the preparation of this paper. Theron embraced the infant's diminutive form, offering a protective barrier, and then opened his eyes to observe her countenance while she slept. The preceding evening had exacted a considerable toll on Elara, and he felt no desire to engage in further activity. He desired nothing more than to embrace her and ascertain that she was indeed safe. This was his most fervent wish. However, he was aware that they were obliged to address the aftermath. Consequently, despite his reluctance to leave her side, he recognized the necessity of his departure. The patient's eyelids opened, and he began to meticulously trace the contours of the patient's face, starting from the patient's chin and working upwards. He derived great pleasure from rousing from sleep before her, thus having the opportunity to admire her impeccable features unobscured. However, upon awakening, he invariably discovered that Elara had been awake, her large, luminous eyes observing him as he slept. "Good morning." He attempted to articulate his sentiments, his lips already curving into a faint smile. However, her actions superseded his words, as she eagerly embraced his in a passionate kiss. He then embraced her with increased intensity and reciprocated the spontaneous kiss, which resulted in a state of breathlessness for both individuals. Upon the realization that her lungs were no longer receiving oxygen, Elara disengaged her lips from the object with a popping sound. This audible release of air was indicative of her body's attempt to compensate for the prior deficiency in oxygen intake. It was imperative for her to disengage from her own kiss, as he exhibited no indication of removing his lips from hers, even after a considerable duration had elapsed. Upon observing the proximity of her diminutive countenance to his own, he experienced an acceleration in his cardiac rhythm, attributable to her unanticipated audacity, the flushing of her cheeks, and the redness of her lips. However, the subsequent utterances caused his heart rate to increase exponentially, his eyes to widen in astonishment, and his mind to become vacant. The utterance of the phrase "I love you" is indicative of profound affection and deep emotional connection between two individuals. The diminutive yet resplendent voice murmured. This marked the first occasion on which Elara had openly expressed her sentiments toward him, and the first instance in which she had articulated the word love with those lips, which were left plump and redder than usual after the brief kiss. He had previously expressed his feelings to her, and even reiterated them on multiple occasions during their embrace, yet she remained silent, merely offering a shy gesture as she enfolded herself in his embrace, concealing her face within his chest. The affectionate response evoked a profound sense of contentment within him, thereby negating any expectation of reciprocity in his verbal expressions. However, upon hearing them, he experienced a profound sense of completeness and elation. He now comprehended the precise sentiments she experienced when she uttered those very words, and the rationale behind her failure to respond. Her confession rendered him mute. He embraced her more tightly, moving his head closer to the crook of her neck, and inhaled the strawberry scent. Additionally, he experienced a sense of embarrassment, and his inclination was to conceal his slightly flushed countenance. At the age of 100 years, he had only recently come to understand the true meaning of love. Theron. The diminutive female uttered her words in a hushed tone, however, he refrained from responding, instead opting to await her continuation of the discourse. The subject's desire is to. Her subsequent statements elicited a profound response, resonating with him on a deeper level. It is imperative that you mark me, Elara articulated. Upon awakening and perceiving him in a state of repose by her side, she found herself unable to disassociate the pristine image of his countenance from the sanguinary one that had been present the previous night. Her heart continued to race with concern at the thought that she had nearly lost him. Upon awakening, she found herself unable to wait any longer. She had reached a point where she could no longer delay. The distinctive mark that could be observed on his lean neck, serving as irrefutable evidence that Theron was indeed hers, was a testament she had sought. The irrefutable evidence indicated that she was his. Upon hearing the utterances that imbued him with a sense of profound fulfillment, Theron, perceiving her determination and the fortitude of the otherwise reticent woman, did not hesitate to seek confirmation of her statements. Elara was not the type of person to utter words that did not align with her true sentiments. Maintaining his proximity to her face, which was nearing the crook of her neck, he gradually opened his mouth and, with his already protruding canines, sank his fangs into the tender skin. 5 years later, Mom! Liara's exclamation, characterized by its heightened emotional intensity, signaled her urgent approach toward her mother. "What is it?" Myrna inquired with an impassive countenance, exhibiting neither emotional disclosure nor any discernible interest in the information Liara appeared to be desirous of articulating. "It has been brought to our attention that an invitation has been received from the palace." Liara's response, unmoved by the despondent disposition of her mother, serves as a counterpoint to the prevailing sentiment. "Oh?" Her mother's words suggested that her curiosity had been piqued to some extent. The season had now transitioned to summer. Typically, the king would only request the presence of the subjects during the winter ball at the royal palace. The rationale behind the decision to summon them at this particular juncture remains unclear. The subject demonstrated an understanding that the card was a summon, despite the word invitation inscribed on it in gold lettering. This is due to the fact that an invitation is a more appropriate word than summon. However, from the perspective of the king, these two concepts were equivalent. The response was affirmative, accompanied by the suggestion to direct one's attention to a specific location. Liara proceeded to open the card and present it to her audience. Myrna, perceiving an urgency in the summons, directed her attention toward the matter, her eyes expressing astonishment. "His Highness, the 17th King of the werewolf race, Theron J. Wolf, hereby extends an invitation to the Alpha and Beta couples of the Silverhold Pack to attend the official introduction of Her Highness, the rightful Luna of all the packs. Elara's residence greetings, Luna." A well-dressed woman was greeted by an even more glamorous woman who was standing before her. Liara's sartorial choices, which at first glance suggested a high financial investment, were complemented by ostentatious jewelry and a substantial application of cosmetics. She then turned to the voice that had previously called her. She smiled, placing her glass of wine on the table, and then kissed her friend's cheeks in response to her greeting. The woman was the final attendee to arrive for the social gathering she had organized. Consequently, the group was able to disperse and convene in the living room to discuss current events. The dozen women seated on the chairs and couches were her close companions since childhood, and as Liara had become their Luna, the women had cultivated an even more profound friendship. It was an anticipated outcome. It is reasonable to assume that any individual would seek to flatter their Luna, thereby ensuring a more distinguished position in the pack as a consequence of their everlasting friendship. Elara also expressed a fondness for their presence and friendship. The incessant praise and recognition she received at every opportunity, coupled with the chance to showcase her abilities, were the primary sources of her motivation and purpose. It has been observed that the subject's appearance is improving significantly on a daily basis. It is noteworthy that her physical features are consistent with those of a mother, despite the absence of obvious signs of childbirth. To be forthright, the garments in question are, as one would expect, from the present year's collection. It is evident that no other specimen is as aesthetically pleasing as the subject, even among the recently developed canines. The alpha's affection for the subject is said to increase with each passing day. One of her acquaintances immediately began to speak, having only just taken a seat on the sofa. Despite being internally situated within the woman's cognitive domain, she engaged in a verbal diatribe directed at Elara, employing a comprehensive array of derogatory expressions. The purported Luna, who was entrusted with the responsibility of managing the financial resources for the benefit of the pack, was engaging in profligate spending, prioritizing her own indulgences over the collective well-being of the pack. It is evident that she would not resemble a mother, for what mother would? The alpha of their pack was the one who handled everything for his heir. Elara did not contribute to the well-being of the young boy. The role of the mother in this context is a subject of particular interest, as it appears to deviate from the expected norm. Her sole merit, it seemed, lay in her capacity to procreate. It is also noteworthy to mention the profound affection the alpha harbored for her. The man would often refrain from seeing her for extended periods of time, sometimes for days. Periodically, rumors circulated regarding his alleged romantic involvement with other women. Does this subject evoke an emotional response? The man was unable to tolerate even the sight of her. Nonetheless, given the fact that the Luna exercised a considerable degree of influence, albeit solely in the presence of the rest of the pack and not the alpha, it is evident that her impact was not negligible. Indeed, it is difficult to identify another individual who possesses the same level of expertise and experience as you. I am embarrassed now that I considered wearing clothes from last year's collection and discovered that they were aesthetically acceptable. The subsequent female participant emitted a sigh, indicating that she was of a similar mindset to the previous participant. Elara's demeanor throughout this exchange was characterized by a subtle smile, indicating a tacit acceptance of the statements made by her interlocutor. The compliments continued for a duration, as the group members offered reciprocal expressions of admiration or, at the very least, expressed concurrence with the statements of others. After a series of compliments and curses, the girls were finally able to engage in a discussion about other topics. Therefore, the subject was changed. It was not anticipated that Elara would engage in flattery, as she had previously done so. However, following the appearance of the alpha mark on her neck, she ceased this behavior. I have received certain information from the royal court. The woman's enthusiasm was palpable as she conveyed the information to her audience, her eagerness to share the news surpassing even the previous intensity she exhibited when offering a compliment to Elara. Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.